You think the worst thing a place can hold is a ghost, a single tragic soul bound to a moment of pain. But you're wrong. The true horror isn't a spirit. It's an echo, a memory so violent, a hunger so deep, or a sorrow so loud that it doesn't just haunt a location, it infects it. It saturates the bricks, the earth, the very wiring in the walls, turning a home into a recording, a town into a feeding ground, and an ordinary building into a broadcast tower for pure anguish. These are not stories of things that go bump in the night. These are stories of places that have learned to scream back, and of the people who became unwilling parts of their terrible, endless cycles. The first time I walked through 217 Blackwood Lane, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. This was unusual for me, a lifelong city dweller who'd never considered trading my cramped apartment for a two-story Victorian in a town where the population sign still read ST 1894. The realtor, a cheerful woman named Marjorie with helmet-stiff hair, called it a character home. She wasn't wrong. The house seemed to have a personality. Sunlight streamed through stained glass panels beside the front door, casting jewel-toned shapes on the polished oak floor. There were built-in bookshelves, pocket doors, and 5 fireplaces. It was more space than I'd ever imagined owning, and the asking price, suspiciously low, was within my budget thanks to a recent inheritance. When I asked about the history, Marjorie became brisk. The previous owner was an elderly man, Mr. Alden. He passed peacefully in a nursing home. The family is motivated to sell. She didn't meet my eyes as she said it. I should have recognized the evasion for what it was. The move was chaotic, as moves always are. Boxes formed labyrinthine walls in every room. My cat, Binks, hid under the clawfoot tub for 2 straight days. But by the end of the first week, I'd found a rhythm. I'd chosen the smaller, sun-drenched bedroom at the back of the house as my own. The larger front bedroom, with its view of the sprawling oak tree in the yard, I designated as my office. It was on my first Monday working from home that I noticed the first peculiarity. I was on a video call, listening to a colleague drone on about quarterly projections, when I saw a brief, dark shape cross the doorway behind me in the monitor's reflection. I spun around, my heart leaping. Nothing there. I chalked it up to sleep deprivation and the stress of the move. The incidents were small, isolated, and easy to explain away. A faint whiff of pipe tobacco in the upstairs hallway, though I'd never smoked. The distinct sound of a rocking chair creaking in the empty room next to my office, a room I used for storage. One night, I woke up certain I'd heard a child giggling. I lay rigid in bed, listening to the old house settle with pops and groans. It's just the pipes, I told myself. It's an old house, but a colder, quieter part of my mind whispered that pipes don't sound like laughter. The first truly undeniable event happened 2 weeks in. I'd bought a vintage writing desk for my office. As I was polishing it, I found a small, locked drawer with a delicate brass keyhole. Intrigued, I spent an afternoon hunting for the key, finally finding it taped to the underside of a windowsill in the pantry. A hiding place I hadn't searched. Fit perfectly. Inside the drawer was a single item, a black and white photograph of a little girl, maybe 8 years old, sitting on the porch swing that still hung on the front porch. She wore a pinafore dress and had solemn eyes. Written on the back in elegant cursive was, Eleanor, Summer 1932. She loves the swing. A strange tenderness filled me. I propped the photo on my desk, a nod to the house's past. That night, I dreamed I was that little girl, pushing the swing with my bare toes, feeling the warm summer wood beneath my feet, the taste of lemonade sharp on my tongue. I woke with the taste still there. Then came the whispers. They started as nearly subliminal murmurs at the edge of hearing when the house was quiet. I'd be reading in the living room and hear what sounded like 2 people having a hushed, urgent conversation in the kitchen. I'd walk in and it would stop. First, it was infuriating. Then it became terrifying. I began recording audio on my phone, leaving it running in empty rooms. On the 3rd night of this, I played back a 6-hour recording from the downstairs hall. For 5 hours and 58 minutes, there was nothing but the occasional hum of the refrigerator. But in the last 2 minutes, clear as day, were voices. A man's voice, strained and weary. "We can't keep going like this." A woman's voice, sharp with tears. "She's not getting better. She doesn't even know us anymore." Then, a soft, confused child's voice. "Where's my dolly?" I deleted the file immediately, my hands shaking. I felt like I'd eavesdropped on a private grief a century old. I decided to research. The local library's historical archives were disorganized but thorough. I found the deed for 217 Blackwood. It was built in 1898 by a shipwright named Samuel Hargrave. He and his wife, Constance, raised 3 children there. The house changed hands a few times in the early 20th century. Then, in 1925, it was purchased by Dr. Alistair Finch and his wife, Vivian. They had 1 daughter, Eleanor. My breath caught. The girl from the photograph. I dug deeper into the Finch family. Dr. Finch was a respected physician. Vivian was active in the town's garden club. Eleanor was remembered in a society column for winning a spelling bee in 1934. They seemed like the perfect family. But the trail went cold after 1938. There were no more mentions of Eleanor. The next record was the sale of the house by Dr. Finch in 1941. He sold it alone. Vivian was not listed on the deed. The town records clerk, an elderly man with kind eyes, saw me poring over the microfiche. "The Finch place," he said, his voice dropping. "Tragic story. The little girl, Eleanor, took sick with a fever. It damaged her mind," they said. "Stopped recognizing her parents. The mother, Vivian, couldn't bear it. She walked into the river one winter night. Dr. Finch left town soon after. Couldn't stand the memories, I suppose." I thanked him, my throat tight. The grief in the whispers made sense now. Armed with this tragic history, I returned home with a new perspective. The house wasn't haunted by malicious spirits, but by echoes of profound sorrow. I felt a pang of sympathy for Eleanor, the little girl trapped in a broken mind, and for her shattered parents. That evening, I spoke aloud to the empty air. "I'm sorry for what happened to you," I said, feeling foolish but sincere. "You're safe here. You can rest." For 3 days, the house was silent. Not just quiet, but a deep, profound stillness. Binks stopped hiding and began sleeping contentedly in sunbeams. I thought I'd solved it. I thought I'd made peace with the past. I was wrong. The silence wasn't peace. It was absorption. I was working at my desk, the photo of Eleanor beside me, when a wave of dizziness hit me. A flood of images that weren't mine crashed into my mind. The feel of a starched pinafore, the smell of baking bread from a kitchen that wasn't my kitchen, the terrifying, blurred faces of 2 people who called themselves Mama and Papa but were strangers. Accompanying it was a deep, wordless confusion and a longing for a doll named Liza with a porcelain head. Gasped, gripping the desk. It was Eleanor's memory. The house wasn't just playing back recordings. It was trying to give me the memories, to make me understand them from the inside. The horror wasn't in hearing a ghost. It was in becoming, for a fleeting second, the ghost herself. The house didn't just remember. It wanted to share, and I had just invited it in. Part 2 of 7. The memory echo of Eleanor's confusion lingered like a psychic stain for hours. I felt disoriented, my own thoughts slippery, as if another consciousness had briefly brushed against mine. I tried to rationalize it as a panic attack triggered by the sad story and my own overactive imagination. But the taste of that unfamiliar bread, the texture of that starched fabric, they were too vivid, too specific. That night, I dreamt not as an observer, but as Eleanor. I was in a sunroom that no longer existed in the house, arranging teacups for invisible guests. A woman with a kind, strained face, Vivian, knelt beside me. "Who am I, darling?" she asked, hope and desperation warring in her eyes. In the dream, I looked at her and felt nothing but polite curiosity for a stranger. "I don't know," I heard myself say in a child's high voice, "but would you like some tea?" I woke with Vivian's heartbreak sitting in my own chest, a leaden, foreign weight. I resolved to set boundaries. This was my home now. I would not be a passive receptacle for a century's worth of trauma. I took down Eleanor's photo and put it back in the locked drawer. I played loud music during the day. I avoided the storage room where the rocking chair sound originated. For a few days, the strategy seemed to work. The whispers stayed away. No more phantom smells or fleeting shadows. I began to relax, telling myself the episode had been a unique convergence of stress and suggestion. My work required deep concentration, and I found I could only achieve it in the front office. One afternoon, immersed in a complex data analysis, I had the sudden, unshakable urge to draw. It wasn't a passing fancy. It was a compulsion. My hands felt restless, twitching with the need to hold a pencil. I never drew. I had no artistic talent. Ignoring the impulse, I tried to refocus on my spreadsheet. A sharp, stabbing pain bloomed behind my left eye. I squeezed my eyes shut. Behind my eyelids, I saw not darkness, but a clear image. A detailed, technical sketch of a ship's hull cross-section, complete with notations about timber stress and joint angles. The pain receded as soon as I opened my eyes and grabbed a notepad. Almost in a trance, I began to replicate the image from my mind. My hand moved with a confidence and skill that were not my own. In 20 minutes, I'd produced a perfect architectural drawing. At the bottom, my hand, not my hand, scrawled a signature, S. Hargrave, 1901. Samuel Hargrave, the shipwright who built the house. This was a new and terrifying escalation. The house wasn't just sharing sensory memories. It was imparting skills, the muscle memory of its former inhabitants. I stared at the drawing, a cold terror seeping into my bones. This was no longer about echoes. This was about imposition. The quiet that followed my initial sympathy hadn't been the end. It had been the house learning how to connect to me more deeply, like a synaptic pathway strengthening with use. I had opened a door, and now something was trying to walk through. I sought professional help, though I knew how it would sound. I made an appointment with a therapist, Dr. Evans, in the next town over. I framed it as adjustment anxiety and vivid dreaming following a major move. I described the stress, the isolation, the history of the house. I did not mention the whispers on the recording or the shipwright's drawing. She listened patiently, then suggested grounding techniques and mindfulness. The mind under stress can create powerful narratives to explain unfamiliar feelings, she said gently. Old houses have character. That character can feel like a presence. You're not haunted. You're human. Her explanation was logical, comforting, and utterly wrong. I left feeling more alone than ever. That night, the house retaliated for my attempt to seek outside intervention. I was woken not by a sound, but by a sensation. The feeling of cold, swift water rushing over my legs, soaking through heavy wool skirts, pulling at me with insistent, deadly force. I sat bolt upright in my dry bed, gasping, my muscles tense against a current that wasn't there. I could smell the muddy decay of a riverbank, feel the icy shock stealing my breath. Vivian. This was no memory of watching someone drown. This was the memory of drowning. It was the last few seconds of Vivian Finch's despair, relayed to me with horrifying intimacy. I stumbled to the bathroom and vomited. I spent the rest of the night on the couch downstairs, all the lights on, Binks clutched to my chest. The house had shown me its ultimate tragedy. It was a violation, a psychic rape. The next morning, hollow-eyed and trembling, I knew I had two choices: flee or fight. Selling so soon would mean a financial loss I couldn't afford. More than that, a stubborn part of me refused to be driven from my home. If this was a phenomenon with rules, I needed to learn them. I went back to the library, this time looking for anything on the house's construction. I found Samuel Hargrave's personal journals in a special collection. He wrote of building a legacy in timber and nail, a home that would hold the warmth of a family within its very bones. One passage, written after the house was finished, chilled me. I have built more than a shelter. A house is a vessel. It holds light, heat, sound. With the right timber, cut in the right season, and a craftsman's intent, I believe it can also hold memory. The laughter in the parlor, the whispered prayers in the bedroom, the warmth of the hearth. These are not lost to the air. They soak into the grain, become part of the structure. A house remembers. He had done it on purpose. Hargrave wasn't just a skilled builder. He was an occult craftsman of sorts. He had intentionally used materials and techniques to make the house a psychic sponge, a vessel for emotional residue. The low price, the quick sale, the Alden family must have known. They'd gotten out and were desperate to pass the curse along. I wasn't living in a haunted house. I was living inside a sentient memory bank, and its programming was glitching, trying to download its stored files into the new, living hardware, me. I returned home, a plan forming. If the house operated on resonance and emotion, perhaps I could overwrite its old files with new, stronger ones. I threw a party. I invited a handful of new acquaintances from town, colleagues from my remote work, and a few old friends willing to drive out. I filled the house with loud music, laughter, the smell of good food and wine. I gave tours, pointing out the original features with pride, forcing my own narrative onto the space. For one night, 217 Blackwood Lane was a house of joy and light. My friends commented on its amazing vibe and warm atmosphere. I smiled, pretending the warmth wasn't a fever of stored sorrow. The party was a short-term success. The oppressive atmosphere lifted. For over a week, I experienced no echoes, no compulsions, no invasive dreams. I began to hope I had recalibrated the house's resonance. I started a new project, painting the downstairs hallway a bright, cheerful yellow. I was on a ladder, carefully cutting in along the crown, molding when I heard the front door open and close. "Hello," I called, thinking a delivery person had entered by mistake. No answer. I climbed down and peered into the empty foyer. Then I heard it from the parlor. The distinct, rhythmic snick-snick of shears cutting through stems. I walked to the doorway. The room was empty, but on the table by the window, where there had been nothing, now sat a cut crystal vase. And in the vase was a fresh arrangement of purple violets and white lilies of the valley. Their scent filled the room, a sweet, funeral parlor smell. I knew, without knowing how I knew, that this was Vivian Finch's signature arrangement. She was reminding me she was still here. The house hadn't been reset. It had simply been waiting for the noise to fade so it could continue the upload. And the memories were now manifesting physically. The line between echo and reality was dissolving. The vessel was beginning to overflow. The flowers wilted with unnatural speed. Within 2 days, the vibrant violets and lilies had turned to a black, slimy sludge in the vase, filling the parlor with a cloying, rotten sweet stench. Cleaning it felt like handling something unholy. I dumped the contents into the outside trash, scrubbed the vase with bleach, and left it on the porch. The physical manifestation terrified me more than any whisper. The house was gaining influence, moving from affecting my mind to altering my physical environment. The memory of Samuel Hargrave's journal burned in my thoughts. A house remembers. It wasn't a metaphor. The very plaster and timber were encoded with emotional data, and under the right conditions, my presence, my empathy, my fear, it was decoding itself back into reality. Sleep became a battleground I avoided. I existed on caffeine and adrenaline, working until my vision blurred, then collapsing into exhausted, dreamless chunks on the couch. My physical health deteriorated. I lost weight. Shadows pooled permanently under my eyes. Binks began behaving strangely again, not hiding, but watching fixed spots on the wall for hours, his tail twitching. One morning, I found him batting at a baseboard in the upstairs hall, pawing at something only he could see. When I pulled him away, my fingers brushed the wallpaper. It felt warm, and for a second, the faded floral pattern seemed to shift, the vines curling and uncurling like living things. I snatched my hand back. The house was waking up. The next invasion was audible but profoundly different from the whispers. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard music. It was a tinny, distant ragtime piano tune, the kind from a gramophone. It was coming from the wall behind the stove. I pressed my ear to it. The music was clearer there, as if bleeding through from another room in another time. I could hear the faint crackle and pop of the recording, the occasional burst of muffled laughter. Party. My earlier party had somehow activated this older, fainter one, like playing a new record too loudly had vibrated the needle onto an old groove hidden beneath. I got a glass and put it to the wall, a childhood eavesdropping trick. The sounds clarified. I could make out snippets of conversation. Invest in railroads? The new motor car? Dreadful what happened to the Finches. At that last phrase, the music screeched to a halt, replaced by a high-pitched ringing, then a profound silence from the wall. Then, a new voice, clear and cold and directly into my ear through the glass, as if the speaker were on the other side of a paper-thin barrier. Some things are not for listening. I dropped the glass, shattering it on the floor. The house was establishing rules. It would share its memories, but on its terms. I was an archivist, not a curator. My research, my prying, was a violation. I was being scolded. The realization sparked a new, dangerous emotion in me. Anger. This was my house. I paid the mortgage. I was done being a passive victim to its psychic leakage. I decided on a more direct form of overwriting. I would renovate. I would tear out the old, memory-saturated materials and replace them with new, sterile ones. I started with the storage room, the source of the rocking chair. Armed with a crowbar and a reckless fury, I began tearing down the old lath and plaster. Dust filled the air. With the first chunks of wall falling, I felt a sharp, collective pang of distress, not my own. It was as if I'd torn a bandage off a wound. I kept going. Behind the plaster, I found something. Tucked into a niche between the studs was a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. My anger evaporated, replaced by a thrumming dread. I carefully lifted it out. Unwrapping the faded linen, I found a child's things. A porcelain doll's head, one eye cracked, a small, hand-stitched sampler that read, "Bless this home," and a lock of fine, blonde hair tied with a black ribbon. Eleanor's hidden treasures, the things she might have clung to as her world disintegrated. The moment I touched the doll's head, a torrent of images hit me. Not confusion this time, but a later memory. A teenage Eleanor, her body grown but her mind still a child's, sitting in this room that was now a prison, not a nursery. Rocking endlessly. Her father, Dr. Finch, now old and stooped, kneeling before her, tears cutting through the stubble on his cheeks. "My sweet girl," he whispered, "I have tried everything. Forgive me." He held a silver spoon to her lips. In the memory, I, as Eleanor, swallowed the bitter liquid obediently. It was not medicine. It was a sedative, strong and dark. The memory faded into a velvety, perpetual twilight, the rocking chair slowing, stopping. This was not the fever's damage. This was the result of a long, slow silencing. Dr. Finch, in his despair, had chosen to quiet the daughter he could no longer reach, to bury the living ghost in his home under a chemical blanket. The grief in this memory was a bottomless well, thick with guilt and a terrible, loving cruelty. I slumped against the exposed studs, the doll's head in my hand, weeping. I wasn't crying for myself anymore. I was crying for Eleanor, for Vivian, for Alistair Finch. The house had won this round completely. It had forced me to witness its deepest, most private shame, and in doing so, it had forged a bond of shared, horrific knowledge. My anger was gone, replaced by a devastating empathy. I carefully re-wrapped the bundle and placed it back in the wall, patching the hole poorly. My renovation war was over. I couldn't fight a tragedy. I was now its witness and, in some terrible way, its keeper. That night, the house offered a twisted form of solace. Exhausted, I fell into a deep sleep in my bed. I dreamed I was Alistair Finch. I sat at a massive oak desk in a study, the room that was now my office, writing with a fountain pen. The weight of the house pressed on me. Every creak a reproach, every silence an accusation. The ink on the page wasn't words, but intricate, looping patterns that morphed into faces. Vivian's, Eleanor's. I felt his profound loneliness, his intellectual arrogance shattered by a problem he couldn't cure, and the crushing weight of a love that had turned into a prison sentence for all of them. I woke with the taste of his preferred brandy in my mouth and the profound, weary conviction that selling the house in 1941 had been an act of surrender, not escape. He'd left, but he'd left everything that mattered behind, sealed in timber and memory. The following morning, I experienced my first true moment of coexistence. I was making toast, and I clearly felt a hand on my shoulder, a gentle maternal squeeze. No fear accompanied it, only a wave of bittersweet warmth and the scent of lavender. Vivian, perhaps thanking me for understanding, or perhaps offering comfort to another lonely woman in her kitchen. I didn't jump. I stood still, allowing the sensation to fade. "You're welcome," I whispered. This was the new reality. I was no longer just a tenant. I was becoming a successor, a living annex to the house's museum of sorrow. The memories weren't attacking. They were integrating. The line between where the house ended and I began was growing faint. I was, piece by piece, memory by memory, becoming a part of the vessel that a fragile, unsettling routine settled over 217 Blackwood Lane. The house and I reached a tacit understanding. I stopped fighting the memories, and in return, the more aggressive manifestations, the physical apparitions, the terrifying tactile hallucinations, ceased. What remained was a constant, low-grade psychic seepage. I'd catch a glimpse of a man in a waistcoat from the corner of my eye, only for him to dissolve when I turned. The smell of pipe tobacco or lavender would drift through a room and vanish. Sometimes, while working, I'd find myself humming a tune I didn't know, a waltz from 1910. I started keeping a journal, not of my life, but of theirs. I documented the memories as they came. Memory of Samuel Hargrave. Pride at the joinery in the main staircase, 1899. Memory of Vivian Finch. Anxiety before a garden club tea, 1937. Scone recipe included. Memory of Eleanor Finch. Sensation of cool grass under bare feet, ca. 1933. I was the house's scribe, recording the data it was determined to offload. This strange symbiosis came at a cost. My own memories began to feel thin, distant. Remembering my college graduation or my first kiss required effort, as if those files were stored on a failing drive, while the Finch family's memories were immediate and vivid. My personality started to blur at the edges. I developed a preference for tea over coffee. I caught myself using archaic phrases like, "I should think so," or "quite right." One evening, I looked in the mirror and didn't immediately recognize my own exhausted face. For a split second, I expected to see Vivian's weary elegance or the soft confusion of Eleanor. The outside world became an intrusion. Friends called less often, put off by my distraction and the odd, formal turn my speech had taken. My work suffered. My boss scheduled a video call to express concern about my missed deadlines and a change in the quality of my engagement. I struggled to explain, to sound like my old, competent self, but my thoughts were a soup of other people's pasts. I ended the call knowing my remote position, my tether to my old life, was in jeopardy. The house, perhaps sensing my vulnerability to the external world, made its boldest move yet. It began to reconcile its memories. One rainy afternoon, I experienced a convergence. I was in the parlor, and it happened all at once. I was Vivian, arranging the violets and lilies, her heart a hollow ache for the daughter laughing in the garden outside. Simultaneously, I was young Eleanor in that garden, chasing a butterfly, her mind a bright, simple joy, and I was Alistair, watching them both from the study window. His love for them a painful knot of hope and dread in his chest. For one impossible, overwhelming moment, I held the complete emotional circuit of the family. The love, the loss, the tragic disconnect, within my single consciousness. It was beautiful and devastating, a symphony of ruin. When it passed, I was on the floor, sobbing, the rain pattering against the stained glass. The house wasn't just showing me scenes. It was trying to make me understand the whole story, to feel the system of their lives as a single entity. This convergence broke something open in the house. The barriers between stored memories seemed to weaken. Echoes began to interact. I'd hear Vivian's voice call, "Eleanor," and a moment later, hear a child's giggle from the opposite end of the hall, as if the memory of the child was answering the memory of the mother across the years. The rocking chair in the storage room would creak, and the gramophone music would start up softly in the parlor. a ghostly accompaniment. The house was no longer a static archive. It was becoming a dynamic, replaying simulation, a phantom family going through the motions of its life and tragedy, with increasing fidelity. And I was being cast in a role. One evening, as I walked past the open door to the dining room, I saw it. The table was set for 4. Not a vague impression, but solid-looking china, gleaming silverware, crystal glasses reflecting the lamplight. At the head of the table sat a shimmering, semi-transparent figure of Alistair Finch. At the other end, Vivian, a younger, clearer-eyed Eleanor, sat to one side. The 4th chair, next to Eleanor, was empty. They were all looking at it. Then, as one, they turned their heads and looked directly at me in the hallway. It was an invitation or a command. The scene held for 5 terrifying seconds before dissolving like mist. The message was clear. The simulation needed a participant to be complete. They wanted me to take my seat at the table. I refused. This was the line I would not cross. To step into the memory as an actor was to surrender my identity completely. I barricaded myself in my bedroom that night, pushing the heavy dresser against the door. From downstairs, I heard the clatter of dishes being cleared, the murmur of polite conversation, the chime of a clock that didn't exist. They were having dinner without me. The normality of the sounds was the most horrifying part. The next day, I found the house's response to my refusal. In my office, on my desk, lay my journal. It was open to a blank page, but writing was appearing on it, as if an invisible pen was moving. I watched, paralyzed, as a graceful feminine script filled the line. "Dearest Keeper," it began. The title stopped my breath. "We are grateful for your compassion, but a story needs an ending to rest. Ours remains unfinished. You have seen our pieces. Help us become whole again. Sit with us. Dine with us. Be our bridge. It is why you came." The writing stopped. The invitation was no longer spectral. It was a written plea from the collective memory itself. The house had given its sentience a voice, and it was calling me by a title that acknowledged my new, awful purpose. I was the keeper, and my duty was not just to record, but to participate, to help these echoing fragments find peace by reenacting their tragedy to its conclusion. I was trapped. Fleeing meant abandoning my financial investment and possibly condemning the next occupant to a faster, more terrifying assimilation. Staying meant slowly ceasing to be myself. But the journal's request offered a glimmer of something else. An ending. If I played my part, could I break the cycle? Could I give the memories the closure they sought and free the house and missile? Communication. The haunting pressure of the house lifted palpably. That night, I slept deeply and dreamlessly for the first time in months. But in the morning, when I went to the journal to look upon the miraculous dialogue, I found the pages blank. Where their words had been, there was nothing. My heart sank. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? Then I noticed. The feel of the house was still changed. The silence was peaceful, not watchful. And on the blank page, a single new line had appeared, in a small, wobbly, child script I had never seen before. It held only 2 words, filled with a simple, profound joy. "Thank you." Eleanor had been listening, too. The house had its ending. But as I traced the child's writing with my finger, a new, quiet dread whispered in my mind. I had successfully mediated a conflict between 2 memories. I had proven I could interact with and change the stored data. What if the house, now aware of this ability, decided it had more stories to tell? Samuel Hargrave's pride, the sorrows of other families who had lived here briefly. The vessel was deep, and I had just shown it how to empty itself through me. I was the keeper, and a keeper's work is never done. The peace I felt might just be the pause before the next storm of memory began, and next time, I might not be dealing with a tragedy I could sympathize with, but with a darkness I couldn't understand. The house remembered everything, and it had just learned how to speak. The peace held for a week. 7 days of glorious, ordinary silence. The air in 217 Blackwood Lane lost its charged, waiting quality. Sunlight felt like sunlight, not a theatrical spotlight on a memory. Binks roamed freely, no longer fixating on invisible presences. I slept through the nights, my dreams my own. I began to tentatively reconnect with the outside world, calling a friend, catching up on work. The journal remained on the desk, its pages blank after Eleanor's "thank you." I started to believe I had done it. I had cured the house, or more accurately, given its trapped memories the resolution they needed to dissipate. My mistake was in believing the house contained only one story. I had addressed the Finches, the loudest, most tragic file in its system. But Samuel Hargrave's journal had been clear. The house absorbed everything. The joy, the mundane, the secret, the shame. I had become a tuned receiver, and now that the strongest signal was gone, I began picking up weaker, stranger frequencies. It started with the tactile memories again, but of a different quality. I'd be washing dishes and feel a sudden, sharp pain in my thumb, the memory of a carpenter's hammer blow from 1902. Walking up the stairs, I'd feel a wave of vertigo and the phantom sensation of long skirts brushing my ankles, a sensation from a servant girl in 1920 hurrying with a tray. These were not emotional echoes. They were imprints of physical experience, random and jarring. The house was no longer trying to tell a story. It was dumping its sensory cache. Then came the new voices. They were fainter, more fragmented than the Finches. I'd catch words in languages I didn't understand. Snippets of Polish, Italian, Gaelic, from the immigrant laborers who helped build the town. I'd hear a fragment of an argument between a husband and wife who rented the house in the 1950s. I'd feel a burst of teenage rebellion from a boy who'd smoked in the attic in 1978. The house was a palimpsest, and I was reading every layer at once. It was mentally exhausting, a constant low-grade psychic noise. Worse were the secret memories, the ones people thought were hidden within these walls. I was in the basement doing laundry when I was hit by a powerful illicit surge of passion and fear. A clandestine meeting between a married woman and her lover, pressed against the cold stone wall where my washing machine now hummed. In the attic, I felt the cold, clenched fist fury of a man counting hidden money. His greed a metallic taste in my mouth. These were not memories offered for resolution. They were psychic trash, the emotional detritus of a century of private lives, and I had no framework to process them. I felt like I was slowly being polluted. I realized the Finches had been a narrative I could follow, a tragedy I could empathize with. This new phase was chaos. The house, having successfully used me to resolve its primary conflict, was now using me as a general drain for all its accumulated psychic sediment. I was no longer a keeper. I was a sewage pipe. My health spiraled. Migraines became constant. I was nauseous, light-sensitive, unable to concentrate. My own memories became harder to access, pushed aside by the torrent of other people's experiences. I'd look at my face in the mirror and see a confusing overlay of strangers' features flickering across my own. I was losing cohesion. In a moment of clarity, I understood the true nature of Hargrave's vessel. It wasn't a recording device. It was a battery. It didn't just store memory. It stored the emotional energy of those memories. The joy, the grief, the passion, the shame. All of it was a form of charge. And I, with my sensitivity and my initial act of compassionate engagement, had plugged myself into it. The Finches' tragedy had been a massive power surge. Now, the steady drip feed of 100 other lives was overloading my circuits. I had to find a way to ground the charge, to discharge the battery without it flowing through me. Hargrave's journal mentioned the right timber, cut in the right season, and a craftsman's intent. His intent had been to create a vessel. My intent had to be to create a release valve. I remembered a fragment from an old book on folklore. Living wood could store memory, but flowing water could carry it away. The house had a history with water, Vivian's death, the rain that always seemed to fall. There was an old, disused well at the very back of the property, covered by a stone slab. It was never connected to the house's plumbing. What if it was never meant for water? My plan was a desperate piece of symbolic magic. I would give the house a new story, a powerful, directed memory of my own, and use it to channel all the other memories out. I would perform a ritual of release. On the night of a new moon, I gathered items. A bowl of water from the kitchen tap, a handful of salt for purification, the journal, and a silver locket that had belonged to my grandmother. My one physical connection to my own past. I moved the stone slab from the well with great effort. The black opening yawned, exhaling a breath of cold, damp air. I knelt beside it. I didn't know any prayers, so I spoke from the heart, my voice shaking. "Samuel Hargrave," I began. "You built a vessel to hold warmth. It holds too much. I am not its master. I am its victim. I release you from your intent." I poured the salt into the well. I held the locket. "This is my memory of love, a family. It is a small memory, but it is mine. I offer it as a key." I dropped the locket into the darkness. A second later, a faint, distant plink echoed up. Then, I opened the journal to the blank pages. I focused not on receiving but on pushing. I visualized all the chaotic fragments, the sensory flashes, the secret shames, the random joys, as a swirling, dark mist inside the house. I imagined that mist being drawn to the well, to the offering of my. I became paranoid about my own emotions. I tried to remain placid, neutral, to not provide any strong fuel for the vessel. But life doesn't work that way. A moment of genuine happiness watching a funny movie left a faint, pleasant echo in the den. A bout of sadness over a missed birthday left a gray pall in my bedroom. I was slowly, passively, repopulating the house with my own emotional ghost. I was building my own haunt. The realization filled me with a profound despair. There was no escape. Selling would pass the now empty, but fully functional vessel to someone else. Leaving would abandon my investment and my sanity. Staying meant consciously living as a ghost in training, editing my own feelings to avoid strengthening the echo of myself that would one day be trapped here. I contacted a specialist, a parapsychologist with a background in architecture. Dr. Armitage was skeptical but intellectually curious. I showed him Hargrave's journal, leaving out the more extreme personal experiences. He examined the house, marveling at the construction. "It's a fascinating example of intuitive sacred geometry," he said. "The ratios, the use of specific, resonant woods like oak and cedar. It's almost like he built a violin, designed to amplify the life within it." When I mentioned the well, his eyes lit up. "A ground. Of course. He built a circuit. The house collects the well grounds. You don't want to disable it. You'd risk a catastrophic feedback loop, potentially driving any sensitive occupant insane. You want to manage it. Keep the ground clear." His advice was pragmatic. Make a monthly ritual of clearing the well. Offer something small, meaningless, to serve as a symbolic discharge. Give the house a release valve for the mundane buildup. A cup of water, a pebble. It's about the intention of flow, not the substance. So that is my life now. I am the permanent super of a psychic powerhouse. On the first of every month, I go to the well. I drop in a stone I've picked up from the garden. I pour a cup of water. I say, "Be carried. Be scattered." I maintain the circuit. The house is no longer haunted by the Finches, or by the chaotic chorus of the past. It is haunted by the quiet, slowly accumulating shadow of my own existence. Sometimes, I'll walk into a room and catch the faint scent of my own perfume from yesterday. I'll hear the phantom echo of my own laugh. I see my own shadow moving in the corner of my eye when I know I'm still. I am layering myself into the timber. I keep Robert Alden's letter framed in my office, a warning and a welcome. He was the previous keeper. I am the current one. I often wonder who will come after me. Will they be sensitive like Alden and I were? Will they feel the faint, fresh imprint of the woman who lived here before and mistake it for a traditional ghost? Will they be strong enough to become the next keeper? Or will they break under the slow pressure of a house that remembers every sigh, every tear, every moment of quiet contentment? The other day, I found Binks sitting in a sunbeam in the parlor, batting at a mote of dust. The sunlight caught something on the floor beside him. I knelt down. Pressed into the grain of the oak, nearly invisible, was a tiny, perfect paw print. From when he was a kitten years ago when the floor was freshly refinished. The house had remembered it, absorbed the impression, and now, under the right light, it revealed this tiny, fossilized memory of joy. I cried then, not from fear, but from a twisted, aching love. This is my home. I am its memory and it is mine. We are in a symbiotic prison of our own making. I tend to it, and in return, it preserves me, piece by piece, feeling by feeling, until the day I become entirely a story in its walls, waiting for the next keeper to listen. The house doesn't remember. It is remembrance, and I have become its living, breathing, final chapter. A chapter that never ends, only deepens, word by silent word. The town of Millhaven wasn't on most maps. It existed in a fold of the mountains, reachable by a single, winding road that seemed to double back on itself more often than it progressed. I ended up there because of my Aunt Ruth, or more specifically, because of what happened after she died. She left me her small, clapboard house on Hemlock Street, along with a modest savings account and a note that read, "Leo, it's quiet here. You've always needed quiet. Just stay out of the basement after dark. Love, Ruth." I'd laughed at the last part, assuming it was her dry, offbeat humor. I wasn't laughing for long. I arrived in late October. Millhaven was a postcard of fading Americana. A main street with a hardware store, a diner, a library that was open 3 days a week, and a bar called the Hollow Log. The people were polite but reserved, their eyes holding a measure of assessment I couldn't quite decipher. They knew I was Ruth's nephew, the one from the city. It was a label that seemed to carry both pity and mild suspicion. Aunt Ruth's house was exactly as I remembered from childhood summers. Cozy, cluttered with books and crocheted blankets, smelling of lemon polish and old wood. The basement was an unfinished concrete space housing the furnace, a workbench, and decades of accumulated junk. The single bare bulb cast deep, long shadows. That first night, exhausted from the drive, I fell into bed and slept like the dead. The noises started on the third night. A soft, rhythmic scraping, like something being dragged across the concrete floor below. Then, a faint, metallic tap-tap-tap, like a pipe being lightly struck. I told myself it was the house settling, the plumbing, an animal maybe. But the sounds had a pattern, an intelligence to their repetition that set my teeth on edge. I remembered Ruth's note, "Just stay out of the basement after dark." I dismissed it. Now, lying in the dark, listening, I felt the first cold trickle of unease. The next day, I explored the basement in the harsh light of afternoon. Nothing seemed amiss. The scrapes on the concrete could have been from moving old furniture. The pipes were old and could knock. I was about to go upstairs when I noticed the corner. The foundation wall there was made of large, rough-hewn stones, unlike the smooth concrete elsewhere. One stone, about the size of a suitcase, looked different. The mortar around it was fresh, a stark gray against the crumbling, century-old original. Someone had recently repointed that one stone. Ruth? Why? That evening at the Hollow Log, I tried to be casual. I mentioned the old house's noises to the bartender, a burly man named Mick. He polished a glass, his expression neutral. "Old houses make sounds," he grunted, "especially down in the hollow. Ground's soft. Shifts." Another patron, an elderly man with a face like a weathered walnut, turned on his stool. "Your aunt was a sensible woman," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Heeded the town rules." I asked what rules. He and Mick exchanged a glance. "Nothing for you to worry about," Mick said, a finality in his tone. "Just keep your cellar door locked at night is all." It wasn't a rule. It was a warning. I felt it in my gut. I bought a heavy-duty bolt lock for the basement door and installed it that afternoon. That night, the sounds were different. Louder. Not scraping, but a slow, heavy thud, thud, thud. Like something pacing. And then a new sound. A whisper. It was too faint to make out words. A sibilant hiss that seemed to rise from the floor vents. It didn't sound like one voice. It sounded like many. The static started on a Tuesday. Not the white noise kind you tune out, but a low, granular hiss that seemed to emanate from the walls of my apartment. I just moved into 4B. A cramped but affordable studio in the old Lansdowne building. The place had good bones, the super said, and rent control. He didn't mention the sound. At first, I blamed the wiring. The building was pre-war, and the electrical system groaned like a tired beast. I'd be reading or trying to sleep, and the static would rise, a sound like a million insects whispering secrets just below the range of comprehension. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, and it had a weird quality. It felt directed, like it was focusing on the space I occupied. If I moved to the bathroom, it would fade in the main room and swell behind the bathroom door. It was hunting for my ears. I complained to Mr. Dalka, the super, a sour man who smelled of cigarettes and mildew. He grunted, said he'd send an electrician. A bored-looking man in a stained uniform came, poked at outlets, declared everything within tolerance, and left. The static remained. Then came the voices. They were buried deep within the hiss, fractured and distant, like a radio broadcast from another planet bleeding through. I couldn't make out words, only the cadence of speech. A question here, a frantic exclamation there, sometimes a soft, rhythmic sobbing. I stopped sleeping. Exhaustion sanded my nerves raw. I bought a white noise machine. It drowned out the hum of the city, but underneath its digital waves, the static and its ghostly voices persisted. A constant, sinister substrate. My research began in desperation. The Lansdowne had a dark history, but of a mundane sort. A suicide in the 70s, a fatal fire in the 50s. Nothing that screamed supernatural radio broadcast. I combed through old newspaper archives at the library. I found a brief mention in a 1948 technical journal. The Lansdowne building had been used as a temporary monitoring station during a pioneering and later discredited ESP research project called Project Janus. The researchers had attempted to tune into human thought waves using modified radio equipment. The project was shut down after lead researcher Dr. Alastair Vance reported unstable and distressing psychic feedback, claiming the equipment was picking up residual emotional frequencies from the building's materials. The article treated it as crackpot science. I printed it, my hands cold. That night, the static changed. It coalesced around a single, clear frequency. A man's voice, crisp with mid-Atlantic diction and frayed with desperation, cut through the hiss. Can't stabilize the signal. It's not broadcast, it's excavation. We're not listening to the living. We're digging up the dead. The walls are screaming. The stones remember every. The transmission dissolved back into gibberish and weeping. Dr. Alastair Vance. It had to be. He wasn't broadcasting a ghost. He was a ghost in the broadcast, a recording of his own panic trapped in whatever psychic frequency he'd unlocked. The apartment wasn't haunted by a person. It was haunted by the echo of an experiment, an open wound in reality that was still leaking. Armed with this fragment, I became obsessed. I bought an old analog radio receiver from a pawn shop, the kind with a tuning dial that could sweep through frequencies with a satisfying click. If this was a frequency problem, maybe I could find the source or even jam it. I set it up in the center of the room. The static was worse near the receiver, as if it welcomed the technology. I began to slowly turn the dial. Through the hiss and pops, I caught fragments. A woman singing a lullaby in French, forever looping. A man arguing with someone who never replied. The frantic counting of numbers. Sobs. Laughter that turned into screams. It was a graveyard of moments. Intense emotional bursts that had been somehow recorded into the very fabric of the building by Vance's misguided machine. The apartment wasn't a place. It was a damaged receiver, and I was the antenna. Then I hit the clear channel again. Vance's voice, calmer now, clinical. Log entry, November 12, 1948. Subject 7. Emotional resonance of profound grief, following the loss of a child. We've managed to achieve a sustained imprint on the test chamber's copper wiring. The frequency is mournful. It replays without attenuation. A breakthrough or a profound ethical catastrophe. I can no longer tell. A test chamber. My apartment. I looked at the exposed brick wall. Wires ran through conduits, but the building's original skeleton would be there. Copper pipes, electrical conduits. They weren't just carrying water and power. They were copper filaments in a giant, psychic recording device. The next discovery broke me. I was tuning the radio, sleep-deprived and shaky, when I caught a new voice. Younger, female, thick with tears. Just leave me alone. Please, I can't do this anymore. The quiet is worse. The quiet is when I hear them. A pause. Then a whisper so clear it was as if she were in the room with me. He's in the walls. He's always in the walls. I knew that voice. It was mine. It was a recording of me, from last week, crying on the phone to my sister about the insomnia. My own moment of despair, my own intense emotional output had been recorded. The machine wasn't just playing back old tapes. It was still on, still recording. The apartment was alive, a hungry ear made of brick and copper, and it was adding my suffering to its library. Horror turned to rage. I wasn't being haunted. I was being consumed. My pain was being siphoned, digitized into this endless, awful broadcast for no one to hear. I tore the radio from the wall, throwing it against the bricks. It shattered. The static didn't stop. It laughed at me. A wet, crackling chuckle that rose from the floorboards. I had to find the source. The machine, the core of Project Janus, had to be here somewhere. Mr. Dalka, when cornered, admitted with a shrug that the original building blueprints showed a sub-basement, sealed off after the war. Nothing down there but old pipes and rats, he said, but his eyes slid away from mine. The entrance, he mumbled, was a maintenance hatch in the floor of the basement laundry room, under a broken dryer. That night, armed with a crowbar, a flashlight, and a reckless fury, I went down. The laundry room was humid and silent. I moved the heavy, defunct dryer. Underneath was a rusted iron ring set into the concrete. I heaved it open. A ladder descended into a darkness that smelled of ozone, dust, and something sweetly metallic, like old blood and spilled chemicals. This was it, the source of the frequency. I was going down to switch it off or die trying. The static in my head swelled to a triumphant roar, as if it had been waiting for me all along. In the end, I learned that there is no true escape from a pattern that has been carved into the world. You can silence a memory, but the vessel that holds it remains. You can starve a hunger, but the pit that contains it is still open. You can turn off a machine, but the frequency it tapped into is still humming, just below the surface of reality. I am not a victim who got away. I am a successor, a keeper, a stabilized signal. The house, the town, the static, they are not behind me. They are within me now. I carry the silence of the well, the map of the tunnels, and the dial for the frequency. My peace is not freedom. It's a vigil. My normal life is a performance for the neighbors, while I alone listen for the telltale signs. A floorboard that creaks with a memory not my own. A draft that smells of wet stone and copper. A quiet moment that threatens to fill with the ghost of static. The horror was never about being chased. It was about being chosen. Chosen to listen, to remember, to feed, or to contain. And once you've been chosen, you can leave the place, but you can't leave the purpose. You become part of the ecosystem of the awful. So I go about my days. I smile. I work. I pretend. And underneath it all, I tend to the terrible quiet I've created, waiting and listening for the echo to start again. Knowing that when it does, it will be my name it whispers first. The cycle never ends. It just finds a new heartbeat. And mine is the one it's using now.